Guadalcanal, August 1942. A Japanese soldier scribbles his final diary entry by candlelight. We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. These Americans, they are not men. They are akuma, devils wearing human skin. Within hours he would be dead, overrun by the very force he feared most, the United States Marine Corps. But why did battle-hardened Japanese troops, warriors of the Imperial Army who had conquered half of Asia, come to call these Americans the devils in flesh? The answer lies in a series of brutal Pacific battles that would forge the Marines' deadliest reputation and break the myth of Japanese invincibility forever. Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, brutality, and psychological warfare, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. We're uncovering the most fascinating untold stories of World War II, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's discover why the Japanese learned to fear the sight of Marine uniforms more than death itself. December 7, 1941, changed everything. As smoke still rose from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, where over 400 Americans lay dead and the Pacific Fleet burned in the Hawaiian sun, a wave of shock and rage swept across the United States. But while America reeled, Japan celebrated. Their military leadership believed they had delivered a knockout blow that would force the United States to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. They were catastrophically wrong. What the Japanese High Command failed to understand was that they hadn't just attacked a naval base. They had awakened something primal in the American psyche. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't break American resolve. It forged it into steel. And nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the ranks of the United States Marine Corps. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Marine recruiting stations across America were flooded with volunteers. Young men who had never considered military service stood in lines that wrapped around city blocks, waiting for their chance to fight back. These weren't professional soldiers or career military men. They were farmers, factory workers, college students, and high school graduates united by a single burning desire: revenge. The Marine Corps had always been different from other branches of the American military. Founded in 1775, Marines prided themselves on being first to fight, an expeditionary force designed to strike hard and fast anywhere in the world. Their training was notoriously brutal, designed to break men down and rebuild them into something harder. The crucible of boot camp at Paris Island and San Diego pushed recruits beyond what they thought were their physical and mental limits. Drill instructors screamed insults inches from faces, forced endless hours of physical training, and created an environment where only the toughest survived. But after Pearl Harbor, something changed. The training became even more intense, more focused, more deadly. Marine instructors began incorporating lessons learned from early Pacific engagements. Recruits learned to fight in close quarters with knives and bayonets. They practiced night fighting, jungle warfare, and amphibious assaults. They were taught to never surrender, to fight until the last round was fired and the last breath was drawn. The Corps was creating warriors specifically designed to fight and defeat the Japanese Empire. The first major test came faster than anyone expected. In August 1942, just 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the 1st Marine Division landed on a hellish jungle island called Guadalcanal. Intelligence reports suggested the island was lightly defended, with perhaps a few hundred Japanese troops guarding an airfield. The Marines expected a quick operation, in and out, secure the airfield, hand it off to the Army. Instead, they walked into 6 months of the most savage fighting the world had ever seen. The Japanese weren't prepared for what hit them. Marine units attacked with a ferocity that shocked even veteran Japanese soldiers who had fought across China and Southeast Asia. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual strength and acceptance of death, American Marines brought industrial-scale violence. They had more ammunition, better logistics, and a willingness to use overwhelming firepower that seemed almost wasteful to their enemies. But it wasn't just the weapons that terrified the Japanese. It was the men behind them. The Marines didn't fight like the Chinese armies Japan had defeated, or the British colonial forces they'd routed from Singapore. These Americans fought with cold, methodical fury. They took positions, held them, and killed anyone who tried to take them back. When Japanese forces launched their traditional banzai charges, mass frontal assaults designed to overwhelm defenders through sheer numbers and warrior spirit, Marines mowed them down with machine guns and artillery, then counterattacked over the piles of bodies. Guadalcanal was hell on earth. The island's dense jungle trapped heat and humidity until the air itself felt like a living thing trying to suffocate you. Mosquitoes carried malaria and dengue fever. Tropical diseases rotted flesh and filled field hospitals with men shaking from fever. Torrential rains turned the ground into sucking mud that swallowed equipment and men alike. And through it all, the fighting never stopped. The Japanese launched attack after attack, trying to drive the Marines back into the sea. They came at night screaming, "Banzai!" and "Marines, you die!" as they charged American positions. Japanese officers, convinced of their racial and spiritual superiority, believed that American soldiers, soft, materialistic, and individualistic, would break and run when faced with the fearless Japanese warrior spirit. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Marines didn't run. They dug into their foxholes and fired until their rifle barrels glowed red hot. When Japanese soldiers broke through the lines in suicidal charges, Marines fought them hand to hand with knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. Stories spread through both armies of Marines who, when their ammunition ran out, picked up Japanese weapons and turned them against their former owners, of Marines who, wounded and unable to walk, propped themselves against trees and kept firing until they passed out from blood loss. One Marine sergeant, later interviewed about a particularly brutal night attack, described it with chilling simplicity. They kept coming and we kept killing them. When we ran out of bullets, we used grenades. When we ran out of grenades, we used our rifles as clubs. When our rifles broke, we used our knives. They wanted to die for their emperor, and we were happy to help them with that. This mentality shocked the Japanese to their core. Their military culture revered death in battle as the highest honor, but they had always assumed that Americans, raised in comfort and democracy, would fear death and seek to avoid it. Instead, they encountered men who seemed just as willing to die, but much better equipped to make the other side die first. The Japanese tried everything to break Marine morale. They infiltrated lines at night, trying to kill Marines in their sleep. They left booby traps on the bodies of dead Americans. They tortured captured Marines in sight of their comrades, hoping to provoke reckless rescue attempts. None of it worked. If anything, these tactics made the Marines more ruthless, more determined, more savage in their response. Marine units began to develop their own terror tactics. Patrols would move through the jungle in complete silence, communicating with hand signals, moving like ghosts through the darkness. They'd strike Japanese positions without warning, kill everyone they found, and disappear back into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. They became expert at ambushes, at setting up kill zones where entire Japanese squads would be annihilated in seconds. The psychological warfare went both ways. Japanese troops would try to demoralize Marines by shouting taunts in English. "Marine, you die tonight!" or "FDR eats shit." Marines responded with their own brand of psychological torture. They'd play American music on portable radios between firefights, big band jazz and swing that reminded Japanese troops these Americans had an entire industrial nation backing them up. They'd deliberately make noise while cooking hot meals, letting the smell of coffee and bacon drift toward Japanese lines where enemy troops were eating cold rice and fighting starvation. But it was the American treatment of Japanese dead that truly horrified the Japanese military. In Japanese culture, respect for the dead was paramount. Bodies were to be recovered, cremated, and the ashes sent home to families. The Marines, by contrast, often left Japanese bodies where they fell. Some Marines took trophies, Japanese flags, swords, helmets. A few even took more gruesome souvenirs, a practice that military command tried to stop but couldn't entirely control. To the Japanese, this desecration of the dead was proof that they were fighting devils, not men. The nickname began appearing in captured Japanese documents and diaries. Oni no America Jin, the Devil Americans, or more commonly, Akuma, demons in flesh. Japanese troops whispered that the Marines were possessed by evil spirits, that they felt no pain, that they couldn't be killed by normal means. Of course, none of this was true. Marines died just like anyone else when shot or blown up. But the myth grew with every Marine victory, every failed Japanese attack, every position that the Marines refused to surrender. If Guadalcanal introduced the Marines' reputation for ferocity, Tarawa cemented it in blood and horror. November 20th, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division prepared to assault Betio Island, a tiny strip of coral in the Tarawa Atoll barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide. Intelligence estimates suggested the island held about 500 Japanese defenders. The Navy promised that their pre-invasion bombardment would be so devastating that you'll be able to walk ashore without getting your feet wet. Both predictions were catastrophically wrong. Betio was actually defended by over 500 Japanese naval infantry, elite troops who had spent months turning the tiny island into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the Japanese commander, boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His men had built hundreds of reinforced concrete bunkers, connected by tunnels, protected by steel-reinforced coconut log fortifications that could withstand naval bombardment, and defended by interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the beaches. The pre-invasion naval bombardment, while impressive, barely scratched these defenses. When the first waves of Marines approached in their landing craft, they discovered another catastrophic problem. The tide was wrong. The Navy had assured them the tide would be high enough for landing craft to clear the coral reef surrounding the island. It wasn't. Landing craft grounded on the reef 500 to 700 yards from shore. Marines had to climb out of their boats and wade through chest-deep water toward beaches that were being swept by murderous Japanese machine gun fire. Men laden with 70 pounds of equipment struggled through the water, while Japanese gunners fired at them from concrete pillboxes. It was a shooting gallery, and the Marines were the targets. Men fell by the dozens, turning the lagoon red with their blood. Bodies floated in the surf. The wounded drowned, dragged under by their equipment before anyone could help them. But the Marines kept coming. Those who made it to shore found themselves pinned down on a narrow strip of sand, barely a few yards wide, with a seawall at their backs and Japanese bunkers spitting fire in front of them. Any movement brought instant death. Marines huddled behind seawalls, behind the bodies of their dead comrades, behind wrecked landing vehicles, while Japanese gunners tried to kill them all. This was where the Marine Corps culture of adapt and overcome proved its worth. When the planned assault broke down into chaos, small unit leaders, sergeants, corporals, even privates, took charge. They organized teams to flank bunkers, to use flamethrowers and satchel charges to destroy fortifications one by one. They crawled through fields of fire, suffered horrific casualties, and kept pushing forward because stopping meant death anyway. One of the most famous moments came when Colonel David Shoup, commanding the 2nd Marine Regiment, waded ashore despite being wounded and established a command post in the middle of the chaos. Standing on the beach with Japanese bullets cracking past his head, he radioed back a message that became legendary. Casualties many, percentage of dead not known, combat efficiency, we are winning. That was the Marine mentality in a nutshell. Even when being slaughtered, even when everything was going wrong, they were still convinced they would win. The Japanese defenders couldn't comprehend this mentality. They had inflicted casualties that should have broken any attacking force. They had killed Marines by the hundreds, wounded hundreds more, and turned the beach into a hellscape of death and destruction. By every rational military calculation, the Marines should have withdrawn, should have called off the assault and tried again later with better planning and more men. But the Marines didn't withdraw. They didn't even slow down. By nightfall of the first day, small groups of Marines had fought their way inland, establishing footholds in the Japanese defenses. The Japanese launched counterattacks throughout the night, trying to drive the Marines back into the sea. Every attack was beaten back with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and sheer determination. Marines who had been fighting for 18 hours straight, who were wounded, exhausted, and surrounded, held their positions because that's what Marines did. The fighting lasted 76 hours. When it ended, over 1, Aozaran Marines were dead, and 2, Aozaran more were wounded out of a force of about 18 Aozars, horrific casualties by any standard. But of the 500 Japanese defenders, only 17 were captured alive. The rest died fighting, often in suicidal last stands when their positions became untenable. The Marines had won Admiral Shibasaki's impregnable fortress, and they'd done it in 3 days instead of the 100 years he'd predicted. The photographs and newsreels from Tarawa shocked America. Images of dead Marines floating in the surf, of beaches literally carpeted with bodies, brought the reality of Pacific War home in a way nothing had before. But those same images had a different effect on Japanese troops throughout the Pacific. They saw that the Marines had suffered terrible casualties and attacked anyway. They saw fortifications that should have been impregnable, breached, and overrun. The message was clear. Nothing could stop the Marines. Not superior fortifications, not fanatical defense, not a willingness to die. The Marines would keep coming until everyone was dead. After Tarawa, the pattern was set. For the next 2 years, Marine divisions would conduct a series of amphibious assaults across the Pacific, each one a calculated bloodbath, each one bringing American forces closer to Japan itself. The names became synonymous with horror and heroism: Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was defended by Japanese troops who had been ordered to fight to the death, who had been told that surrender was worse than death, who had been promised that killing 10 Americans before dying was every soldier's duty to the emperor. And on each island, they encountered the same implacable enemy, United States Marines who simply would not stop coming. The Japanese tried new tactics. On Peleliu, they abandoned the strategy of defending at the beaches and instead created a defense in depth, turning the island's coral ridges and caves into a fortress that could only be taken one cave at a time. It didn't matter. The Marines adapted, developed new tactics for cave warfare, and took the island anyway at a cost of over 1,500 dead and 8,000 wounded. What should have been a 3-day operation, according to pre-invasion estimates, lasted over 2 months of the most savage close-quarters fighting of the war. The Japanese tried new weapons. They used poison gas, captured stocks from the Chinese campaigns, spider holes where single soldiers could pop up behind American lines, and elaborate tunnel systems that allowed them to counterattack positions the Marines thought they'd cleared. Nothing worked. The Marines countered every tactic, overcame every defense, and kept advancing. What the Japanese military leadership never fully grasped was that they were fighting an enemy with fundamentally different values and capabilities. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual strength, warrior spirit, and acceptance of death. Their logistics were primitive by Western standards, their medical care was minimal, and their troops were expected to endure incredible hardships as a test of character. Surrender was not an option. It was a disgrace worse than death. The Marines, by contrast, brought the full weight of American industrial and technological power to bear on every battle. Where Japanese troops fought with limited ammunition and often faced starvation, Marines had virtually unlimited supplies. Cargo ships brought fresh water, food, ammunition, medical supplies, and even luxuries like cigarettes and candy bars. When Marines were wounded, they were evacuated to hospital ships with surgical facilities that rivaled the best civilian hospitals in America. Plasma, antibiotics, and skilled surgeons saved thousands of lives that would have been lost in any previous war. This logistical superiority had a profound psychological effect. Japanese troops, struggling with hunger, disease, and dwindling ammunition, watched their Marine enemies eating hot meals, wearing clean uniforms, and fighting with an abundance of ammunition that seemed almost obscene. One captured Japanese diary from Peleliu recorded, "The Americans waste more ammunition in a day than we receive in a month. They shell empty ground just to be sure it is empty. They use artillery for what we would use a rifle for. How can we defeat an enemy with such wealth?" But it wasn't just wealth. It was how the Marines used it. American military doctrine emphasized combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, artillery, air support, and naval gunfire into a single overwhelming assault. When Marines attacked a Japanese position, they didn't just charge with rifles. They called in artillery to soften up the target, naval guns to destroy bunkers, airstrikes to hit reinforcements, and then sent in infantry supported by tanks and flamethrowers. The Japanese had never encountered such coordinated, overwhelming violence. The psychological pressure on Japanese troops was immense. They were told they were fighting for the emperor, for the honor of Japan, for their families and ancestors. But night after night, they watched American ships on the horizon, more ships than many of them had known existed, all dedicated to killing them. They heard American planes overhead, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, all dedicated to killing them. They faced American artillery that seemed to have unlimited ammunition, all dedicated to killing them. And when the shelling stopped, the Marines came, and the Marines never stopped. Japanese officers tried to maintain morale by emphasizing victories in individual battles, acts of heroism, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese troops. But these speeches rang increasingly hollow as island after island fell to the American advance. Reports filtered back from survivors of various battles, and the message was always the same. The Marines were unstoppable. They came in waves like the tide, and eventually they overwhelmed everything. The nickname "Devils in Flesh" spread throughout Japanese forces in the Pacific. It appeared in captured documents, in intercepted radio transmissions, in the diaries of dead soldiers. Some Japanese troops began to believe supernatural explanations for Marine effectiveness. Rumors spread that Marines were given drugs that made them feel no pain, that they were specially bred for combat like attack dogs, that they were criminals released from prison and given a choice between execution and military service, which explained their apparent contempt for death. None of these rumors were true, of course. The Marines were just men, scared, often terrified, sometimes breaking down under the strain of combat. They died when shot, screamed when burned, cried when their friends were killed. But they had been trained to a level of proficiency and professionalism that Japanese forces couldn't match, equipped with weapons and supplies that Japanese forces couldn't imagine, and backed by an industrial base that made continuous operations possible. February 19, 1945. 3 Marine divisions, nearly 70 Zero-Zeran men, prepared to assault an island just 8 square miles in size. Iwo Jima was a sulfuric volcanic rock 750 miles from Tokyo, home to about 21 Zero-Zeran Japanese defenders who had spent months turning the entire island into a fortress. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, was one of the most capable officers in the Imperial Army. He had studied American tactics, understood Marine doctrine, and designed a defense specifically to inflict maximum casualties on the attacking forces. Kuribayashi knew he couldn't win. Japan's strategic situation was hopeless by 1945. But he could make the Americans pay such a terrible price that perhaps they would negotiate peace rather than invade the home islands. His orders to his troops were simple. Every man must kill 10 Americans before dying. There would be no banzai charges, no suicidal glory attacks. Instead, every cave, every bunker, every position would be defended to the death, forcing the Marines to dig out defenders one by one. The Marines knew they were in for a brutal fight. The pre-invasion bombardment was the longest of the Pacific War, 3 days of continuous naval gunfire and airstrikes. The Navy promised that nothing could survive such a bombardment. They were wrong. Kuribayashi's men had dug so deep into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock that the bombardment barely touched them. When the first Marines hit the black volcanic sand beaches, Japanese gunners emerged from their caves and opened fire. Marines struggled through sand so fine it was like trying to run through coffee grounds, while machine guns, mortars, and artillery turned the beaches into a slaughterhouse. The first waves took horrific casualties, but more Marines kept landing wave after wave until the beaches were so crowded with men and equipment that there was barely room to move. And then the Marines did what they always did. They attacked. They moved off the beaches, taking terrible casualties, and began the slow, brutal process of destroying every Japanese position. It was close-quarters combat at its most savage, flamethrowers burning defenders alive in their caves, grenades thrown into bunkers, hand-to-hand combat in dark tunnels where men fought with knives and bayonets. The most famous moment came on the fifth day when a Marine patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak dominating the southern end of the island. They planted an American flag on top. A few hours later, a larger flag was brought up, and Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment 6 Marines raised the flag against a clear sky. That photograph became the most famous image of World War II, a symbol of American determination and sacrifice. But that flag raising happened on day 5 of a 36-day battle. Even after Suribachi fell, most of Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands. The fighting continued across every yard of the island. Marines advanced by feet and inches, clearing caves with flamethrowers, sealing bunkers with explosives, and fighting a hidden enemy who refused to surrender. General Kuribayashi himself died in the final days of the battle, leading a last attack against American positions. Of the 21 0-0 Japanese defenders, only about 200 were captured alive. Most of them were wounded and unconscious when taken. The rest died fighting, just as their general had ordered. The Marines paid an extraordinary price for Iwo Jima. 821 dead and 217 wounded, nearly 1/3 of the landing force. It was the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. 27 Marines earned the Medal of Honor at Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. Admiral Chester Nimitz later wrote, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. But from the Japanese perspective, Iwo Jima represented something else entirely. Proof that even the most carefully planned defense, even a willingness to die to the last man, couldn't stop the Marines." General Kuribayashi had designed the perfect defense. He had elite troops, excellent fortifications, ample ammunition, and time to prepare. He had inflicted casualties that would have caused most armies in history to break off the attack. And the Marines had taken his fortress anyway. News of Iwo Jima's fall spread through Japanese military units throughout the Pacific and in the home islands. The psychological impact was devastating. If Marines could take Iwo Jima, heavily fortified, fanatically defended, with every tactical advantage going to the defenders, what chance did any other position have? The answer, increasingly clear to Japanese troops, was none. Captured documents from this period show a dramatic shift in Japanese attitudes toward Marines. Early in the war, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, materialistic, and lacking warrior spirit. By 1945, Japanese military intelligence reports described Marines as the most dangerous enemy we have ever faced, and warned that their fighting spirit exceeds our own and their material superiority is overwhelming. The propaganda name "Devils in Flesh" was no longer just an insult. It was a warning. Japanese officers began preparing their troops specifically for fighting Marines. Training emphasized that when Marines attacked, they would not stop. They would not retreat. They would continue advancing no matter what the cost until everyone was dead. Troops were told that fighting Marines was different from fighting other Allied forces. Marines could not be demoralized, could not be frightened, could not be convinced to give up. The only way to stop a Marine attack was to kill every single Marine, and even then, more would keep coming. Okinawa was the final test. Beginning April 1st, 1945, Marine and Army units invaded the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, just 350 miles from mainland Japan. The Japanese garrison numbered over 100 Aozuzeran troops, backed by thousands of Okinawan civilians who had been pressed into service. The defenders knew this was the last line of defense before the invasion of Japan itself. They fought with desperate fury, launching the largest kamikaze campaign of the war against American ships and conducting a defense so savage that the battle lasted 82 days. The Marines faced all of this and won anyway. They advanced across Okinawa's ridges and valleys, fighting through rain and mud, destroying position after position, killing or capturing nearly the entire Japanese garrison. American casualties were horrific. Over 12 Zauzaren dead and 38 Zauzalers wounded, but the Japanese lost everything. The battle destroyed the last effective fighting force between American troops and the Japanese home islands. By the summer of 1945, the question was no longer whether the Marines could defeat Japanese forces. It was how much longer the war would continue and how many more would die. Plans were being drawn up for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. Intelligence estimates suggested that invading the home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese deaths. The Marines who had fought across the Pacific knew exactly what an invasion of Japan would entail. Urban warfare in every city, Japanese soldiers and civilians fighting to the death, a final bloodbath that would dwarf everything that had come before. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Downfall could be launched. Japan surrendered unconditionally on August 15th. Marines who had prepared themselves for one final apocalyptic battle suddenly found themselves at peace. Many of them struggled with the abrupt transition. After years of warfare, after becoming the devils in flesh, how did you go back to being a regular person? The war was over, but the reputation remained. The United States Marine Corps emerged from World War II with a mystique that persists to this day. They had fought in every major Pacific campaign, had suffered terrible casualties, and had never lost a battle. Their iconic images, the flag raising on Iwo Jima, Marines advancing through Okinawan mud, the grim faces of men who had seen too much death, became the visual representation of American military power. But what about the Japanese perspective? In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and transformed into a peaceful democracy, veterans on both sides began to meet and talk about their experiences. Japanese survivors of Pacific battles consistently described their shock at fighting Marines. They spoke of men who seemed to have unlimited ammunition, who called in artillery strikes like they were as common as rifle fire, who never stopped attacking no matter how many casualties they took. One Japanese veteran, interviewed in the 1970s, described his experience at Peleliu. "We were told Americans were weak, that they loved comfort and would not endure hardship. Then the Marines came. They fought in the heat just like us. They fought in the coral caves. They burned us with flamethrowers when we wouldn't surrender. We called them devils, but really they were just better soldiers than us. They had better weapons, better supplies, better training, and they never gave up, just like we were taught never to give up. We were very much alike, the Marines and us. We just had the misfortune to be fighting for the losing side." This grudging respect was mutual. Marines who fought across the Pacific consistently described Japanese troops as brave, determined, and fanatical defenders. The fact that Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered, that they fought to the death in hopeless situations, earned a certain respect even from the Marines who killed them. The war in the Pacific was brutal beyond measure, but both sides recognized the other's courage. The nickname "devils in flesh" ultimately represented something more complex than simple fear or propaganda. It was an acknowledgement that the Marines represented a new kind of warrior, combining ancient martial virtues like courage and determination with modern industrial warfare's overwhelming material superiority. They were men who fought with the fury of warriors, but were backed by the full economic and technological power of the world's most industrialized nation. Today, the Marine Corps continues to cultivate the reputation forged in the Pacific. Every Marine learns about Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They learn about the devil dogs of World War I and the devils in flesh of World War II. They learn that Marines are expected to be the toughest, most determined, most capable warriors in any fight. It's a heavy burden to carry, living up to the reputation of men who fought through hell itself and emerged victorious. The Japanese troops who called the Marines devils weren't entirely wrong. War does bring out something demonic in human beings. The capacity for violence, for brutality, for killing on an industrial scale. But it also brings out something heroic, courage in the face of death, loyalty to comrades, determination to accomplish the mission no matter what the cost. The Marines who fought across the Pacific were both devils and heroes, demons and saviors, killers and liberators. They were, in the end, just men. American boys from farms and cities, factories and schools, who found themselves in the worst circumstances imaginable and did their duty. They paid for every yard of coral and volcanic rock with their blood. Over 19,000 Marines died in the Pacific War, and many more were wounded in body or mind. But they won every battle, completed every mission, and brought the war to a successful conclusion. That's why the Japanese called them devils in flesh, not because Marines were supernatural or invincible, but because they represented something the Japanese military couldn't overcome. The combination of American industrial might, superior logistics, effective training, and men who simply refused to quit no matter what the cost. In the end, the devils won because they were willing to go through hell itself and take everyone with them who stood in their way. The Marines earned their reputation in the crucible of the Pacific War, and it's a reputation they've maintained through every conflict since. From the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea to the streets of Fallujah in Iraq, the Marines have continued to be America's 911 force, first to fight, last to leave. If you found this story fascinating, check out our video on the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, where Marines faced overwhelming Chinese forces in sub-zero temperatures and fought their way to safety. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're bringing you the most incredible stories of courage and combat from history. Thanks for watching, and remember, these stories aren't just about war. They're about what human beings are capable of when tested to their absolute limits. See you in the next one.